Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and insurance markets meet. I'm your host, David Benyon. I'm joined by Blackthorn senior broker Thea Grootenhuis and head of advisory Jerry Smith for a discussion about modern perils and modern assets, UAVs, data centres, and the next frontier of risk. We explore how emerging threats and rapidly evolving technologies are converging in the fragmented, uneasy geopolitical risk landscape. Discussion will draw on some real-world scenarios, looking at how unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, are enabling attacks, the growing vulnerability of data centres as critical national infrastructure, and how disruption quickly translates into business interruption. We start by talking about the war in the Gulf. Our conversation encompasses lessons that are applicable globally, drawn from the Russia-Ukraine war to cartels, organised crime, and terror groups around the world. Our two guests. So Thea Grootenhuis is a senior broker at Blackthorn and joined in 2018. She specialises in political violence and active assailant insurance, as well as crisis management lines such as kidnap and ransom, fixated threat, and war risk personal accident. Thea has a diverse global portfolio ranging from Fortune 500 companies to NGOs operating in conflict zones to real estate and infrastructure projects. Thea has handled clients on a vast array of claim scenarios, ranging from attacks on infrastructure, active shooter incidents, through to large-scale riot and civil commotion events, and most recently supporting clients evacuating out of the Middle East. Jerry Smith leads Blackthorn's advisory practice. He works with the insurance industry, blue-chip companies, national governments, supranational organisations, and international NGOs. Jerry is recognised globally as one of the leading experts in chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive materials, and advises Blackthorn's clients on risk management and crisis response and operational resilience projects. Jerry has over 30 years' experience with the British Army, UK Civil Service, and the United Nations, as well as the private sector. He's worked in over 40 countries on 4 continents. He was head of operations for the verification, disablement, and initial removal of Syria's declared chemical weapons arsenal, and was a senior advisor to the UN and a director of the international chemical watchdog, the OPCW. In 2015, he was awarded an OBE for services to international arms control and WMD counter-proliferation. So what makes this conversation important? Well, as modern perils collide with modern assets, what should risk managers and insurance buyers be doing now to stay ahead? Data centres have become centre stage as a topic within specialty insurance, as an opportunity and as a driver of demand for insurance protection, and as a concentration risk, a source of exposure against man-made as well as natural perils. Drones, or UAVs, are now indispensable to modern warfare. Anyone watching YouTube videos about the frontline combat in Ukraine for the past few years will understand that. Thousands of UAVs have been thrown at the Gulf states since late February. Ukraine is producing roughly 4 million UAVs annually, an army of drones. Most of these are small, remote control first-person view FPV drones. So recent conflicts are democratising access to drone technology. The tech is becoming ubiquitous, commercially available, something you can buy on Amazon. There's plenty of evidence that UAVs are available not just to governments and militaries, but also to non-state actors such as terrorists and criminals. Data centres as well as civilian corporate infrastructure can make easy targets. All that's missing is a small amount of explosive and a malicious motive. Right, let's get into it. Jerry, Thea, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Jerry, let's start with you. So we're recording this episode against the backdrop of everything that's going on in the Middle East right now. We don't want to get tied to fast-moving events, obviously, but what are some of the recurring themes that you're hearing in conversation with clients and with insurance markets?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Well, I think the first thing is to think about the speed of evolution of risks that are being played out. We saw this sort of tempo build up in Ukraine a few years ago, and obviously the last month or so in the Middle East has really shown that sort of speed of change and the effects. I think the second thing that's quite interesting, and speaking to colleagues and clients in the Middle East, is the sort of perception that was always a safe location. And that now we see an exodus of a certain number of people that they're seeing war close up. And it's nothing for the people to actually be seeing missiles in the sky, rockets, explosions. Feeling explosions is an sensation you only have. And so when those perils are being brought right home to them, it does sort of change the estimate.
Obviously, they're doing a cracking job of shooting down 90 whatever percent of it is of those drones and missiles coming into somewhere like Dubai, but it's the perception, isn't it? You can see them in the sky being intercepted.
Absolutely. And as I said, feeling an explosion, there's nothing quite like that. You can watch all the Hollywood stuff you like, but that boom and that experience you get of an explosion close up.
These are all clients on land, right? Nothing in the Strait of Hormuz.
We're also helping out with some, mainly around risk assessments and expert witness, really, around decision making. When you've got the conversations between the charterers, the owners and the crew around making decisions about taking risks or what options they have. So that sort of risk estimate process is something we've been helping out on.
So a question for both of you now. If the war drags on, and obviously things are moving fast, but at this point there's a substantial risk that it will, what are some of the first and second order risks that you're watching most closely? Particularly thinking how the Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi, etc., the other ones that start to feel the pressure around critical infrastructure, things like energy or basic food and water security needs.
Those first, second, third order issues are massively important. If we consider the oil and gas, they are their lifeblood in terms of economy. And so economic impacts there will start to take some tolls.
It's going to take a long time to repair things like the LNG facilities in Qatar.
Absolutely. And that lag time, clearly there are things like the sovereign wealth funds and those sort of financial cushions. But even so, the world itself is affected not only by the oil and gas, but fertilizer as well is an estimate. We're coming into the planting season now for Northern Hemisphere. How that might be affected. Huge amounts of food then gets obviously re-imported back into the Middle East or imported back into the Middle East. And then the more fundamental things, you think about desalination plants. About 100 million people in the Middle East are reliant on desalination for water, for drinking water.
Yeah, it's not a naturally hospitable
No,
part of the globe to live in without things
yeah.
like that.
And we talk about 2 meals away from a riot. You could see how this could move the social cohesion of the Gulf states. Now, I don't think that they're not as fragile as, so we say, the Arab Spring from a decade or so ago. Yeah. But even so, there are some significant issues that could arise if people aren't being able to have the basic services that they're used to.
And the Iranians will want to find ways of causing a disproportionate amount of hurt. Well, they could be. I mean, it's a very different example, but look at the way they recently hit those American aircraft on the ground in Saudi. It's like they know they can't win the war by conventional means, but they can do very specific things that will hurt the Americans disproportionately. Like you've only got a certain amount of those jets that have the AWACS capabilities or whatever. So I know that's a military example, but this is a sort of civilian infrastructure example. If you hit certain things, you can cause a disproportionate amount of hurt.
The two countries are fighting two different wars, and that's the challenge you've got. And Iran has clearly had a long time to prepare this, and they're now executing on that asymmetry. They just play to their strengths.
We saw when the situation developed rapidly a few weeks ago, we were supporting clients evacuating very quickly out of cities like Dubai, which they hadn't necessarily planned for or anticipated. And when the situation escalates like that, triggering insurance policies for locations they perhaps didn't think they were going to be using that for. But I think we're now facing clients also wanting to go back in. So in evacuation, these are economic hubs and they've got their operations there. And so in moments of relative stability, they're wanting to go back, but we know and they experience how quickly things can change. So we're working with our advisory team and responders, crisis management responders, to help navigate and sensibly triage that. And I think when it comes to the wider region and the water and food insecurity, this could lead to a much wider crisis management sort of problem in the region and perhaps affect previously considered benign Gulf states from a security and risk perspective.
Well, before we go any deeper, would you both like to just briefly summarise? You kind of alluded to it with talking about the advisory part of the business and some clients there, but your roles at Blackthorn, where the firm sits in the market, advisory and broking perspectives, how they contribute and come together, when dealing with these kind of perils.
Yeah, so I'm a senior broker at Blackthorn. I specialise in the political violence, terrorism and active assailant insurance, as well as the kidnap for ransom and other crisis management lines. And as an independent broker with our advisory team next to us, we work really closely with them to try and help identify the malicious risks our clients are exposed to and then transfer that into insurance policies and products in the London market as best we can.
I'm the head of advisory at Blackthorn. I came to the insurance sector quite late in careers. I think this is fourth career.
You're a man of many careers.
Yeah, I was in the army for a decade in the 90s and involved in humanitarian demining for a while. I was then at DSDL Porton Down, the Defence Science Laboratory down near Salisbury. and then spent nearly a decade in the UN as a weapons inspector and investigator in various guises with a focus on chemical weapons. So my fourth, joining the insurance sector later in career, has obviously brought me a lot of experience that I can bring into that, and is an exciting and dynamic sector and great to work in.
Jerry, you got a case study involving a Latin American data center, and this really gets into the core of what we'll be talking about today. So, yeah, data center and UAV-enabled attack scenarios. So can you walk us through that example and what you think it tells us about how the threat landscape is changing?
PMLs for high-value projects is obviously not a new thing by a long shot. What was interesting about this data center was that, and we'd looked at quite a few of them before, but what was focusing our mind really was that a sort of standard RDS, a realistic disaster scenario, typically for a terrorism policy, will be a large vehicle bomb. Like Lloyd's standard is a 2,000 kilogram bomb. We looked at this at Mexico, and we felt that was not so realistic in terms of a disaster scenario. So we looked at a smaller device, which would cause some significant property damage. But the team that went down there to look at this, well, there was lots of, as you can imagine, news, and Mexico has got its own particular challenges anyway in terms of the narco terrorism that goes on there, and the use of drones was increasing. And to the extent that it is believed that a number of Mexican cartels actually sent personnel to the Ukrainian legions to learn how to operate drones and have brought that skill set back. So in terms of UAVs and drones now, that barrier to entry of being able to place small targeted explosive devices at particular critical points, essentially a large vehicle bomb is a blunderbuss, right? It's just a big explosive detonation, lots of explosive energy to destroy everything in its path. You can potentially achieve, as we found with this assessment, you can potentially achieve a similar sort of effect. In fact, greater value loss through a targeted placement of devices. I mean, that's one thing to hand place it, but then you don't even necessarily need to have some sort of complex event where you're actually defeating the perimeter. You fly those devices there. And the issue around data centers is that the thermal management and the electricity supplies, they are critical elements. So in fact, the value of the building, the property, is not particularly high. The electronic architecture, that's kind of replaceable. But if you're looking about banks and banks and banks of air conditioning units and uninterruptible power supplies and the power supply, that then starts to become quite a significant replacement time if you damage those things in a particularly targeted way. You don't need to destroy everything. You just need to destroy the key components. And then that operation goes offline. And then the business interruption level of it skyrockets.
So let's move the conversation on to the evolving threat landscape. And as we were just talking about, data centers' points of vulnerability. So Jerry, we've seen UAV capabilities evolve rapidly in recent conflicts. We've talked about Ukraine already, and the Middle East clearly ongoing, and non-government malicious actors like the cartels. What do you think that democratisation of capability means for how we should think about this risk in general terms?
I think if we look at threat in its academic pure form of intent and capability, UAVs, modern UAVs now, they lower that barrier to entry. So the risk driver is not the capability. That capability is now there. It's about intent. And so what we're seeing is that the attack surface, for want of a better word, is expanding. Thinking about security, physical security, it's very much a three-dimensional thing. It's not just about barriers now. It's not about just access control. You've now got three dimensions to deal with. The range of countermeasures for drones can be relatively limited, certainly in advanced economies where there might be sort of legislation around, for example, interfering in the electromagnetic spectrum to stop drones. Also, you pose the risk that if you manage to take out a drone and it drops to the ground, you potentially are liable for damage as a consequence of stopping that drone. So you have to think about risk management in a different way now. And the benefit of drone, as you mentioned, was around targeting of specific vulnerable locations, which in themselves may not be highly valuable, but may be still significant in terms of stopping business interruption.
So in this case, it's an outage, isn't it? You're saying target the AC, and that will take the data center offline.
Absolutely. But if you then target particular components of, for example, the air conditioning, their lead time for replacement could be 18 months. So their value may not be particularly high. If we look at things like electrical transformers, I think there's only one manufacturer in the UK now that makes electrical transformers. So if you take those out, the value of the building is in concerns of the fact that you can't operate it because you simply can't replace the component to allow you to function.
It's a much more complicated task for organisations to map out the threats then, once you're thinking about a supply chain rather than just the actual physical.
Yeah, it ceases to be perimeter-based. It's a whole operation element, and it's about actually ensuring that your response capability is up there in comparison to your prevention, because your chances of preventing may well be reduced. So you've got to be smart about how you respond to a potential incursion.
So Thea, data centres are increasingly treated as, probably rightly so, as critical national infrastructure. Worth saying, why are they such attractive targets for would-be attackers with various motivations? And what are some of the wider vulnerabilities and consequences that you could see from an attack?
I think our reliance on technology and data specifically is sort of ever present and increasing. And data centres being a relatively new focus as that physical representation of this, particularly with the emergence of AI, we're requiring more and more of these centres. Malicious actors now have quite a symbolic target as well as being able to cause mass disruption from an individual site. To Jerry's point, the supply chain business interruption impact of even disabling a small part of a centre, is almost unmapped at the minute until we start seeing some losses and these malicious actors trying to target the supply chain in that way. We've seen them do it before and we've seen the impact on other supply chains, but this is the sort of starting point for potentially a huge sort of impact on scale. Not to be giving anyone any ideas, but, it'd be top of my target list. And I think from the insurance perspective, this is being recognised. And I think there was something came out yesterday that it's expected to be, there's expected to be over $24 billion in premium in relation to data centres by 2030, which, it just shows that these aren't going away and the value of them is only going to increase and therefore be a very attractive target to malicious actors.
So Jerry, from your perspective, how quickly could an incident with a UAV causing disruption translate into material business interruption for a data centre operator?
The key thing is around warning times shrink significantly. Gone are the days of you think about the sort of Irish Republican terrorism, where there was a process where there would be a reconnaissance of a site. Yes. Now, clearly that wasn't meant to be overt, that would have been covert, but the whole process would have potentially taken some time, and the whole process of acquiring and manufacturing a large vehicle, improvised explosive device, would have been quite significant. And with all of that, those chances of the authorities, the police, the intelligence services of being able to interdict that. The speed now is that the acquisition of a UAV is quick, the manufacture of small quantities of explosive is relatively quick, and the speed of attack is quick. Drones are flying at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. The reconnaissance can be done online using Google Maps. You can even practice with a drone simulator online. And then the placement of the targeted explosives. Now, all of that speed means that an attack can be over in literally seconds. And if that targeting is being good, appropriate, and well reconnaissance, well planned, then those significant elements go offline and the process stops. Now, there may well be backups, uninterrupted power supplies, backup generators and that sort of thing. But if that targeting has been done well, that system could be shut down. Now, clearly there are other elements that we haven't recognised. There'll be multi-sites, redundant servers and that sort of elements. But it's still interrupting that process and testing it. And you take it to the next stage is that a well thought out and well designed attack could ultimately attack multiple sites. So you see sites, many sites, and it's difficult to hide large data centres, but certainly smaller data centres, they can be relatively covert or attempt to be covert to try and hide the nature of the activity. And particularly for firms that they may have their own specific requirements and want to have their own data centre rather than relying on the cloud or third parties, they may wish to seek to sort of put those in quite covert locations and keep them very discreet.
I'm not a data centre expert at all, but I mean, they're often, I assume, in quite remote locations sometimes. So it might not have the best response from emergency services, and it might be somewhere that's really out of the way. Yeah, that would potentially more of an impact if it gets hit.
Well, both ways, really. A few years ago, we had a client and actually they decided to hide one of their data centres almost in plain sight. So in an in an urban environment, industrial facility. And their view was that actually hiding a lot of industrial equipment within other industrial areas was the way to mask it. So that was what their approach that they took.
You see in Ukraine, in Russia, it's very difficult to shoot down drones. You see people with like shotguns, or you see purpose-built drone rifles that are designed to take them down one way or another, or you block the signal if it's, that kind of thing. But it's crazy to think about businesses having that kind of kit and technology for a threat. Are we there yet? Is anyone actually doing that?
Yeah, we know several private security companies who
like jammers?
have the tech. It's a combination, I think, of jammers, and then they deploy, their people on the ground. We've definitely seen it around airports in particular. But
well, we've seen that in recent months, haven't we? We've seen Russian, probably drones coming out of a cargo ship flying over, was it Copenhagen?
Yeah, there's definitely the technology there that is in the private sector. So, if you are looking to protect a site, there's probably a few more companies that you could approach for that.
The constraints are around that very issue around timing of warning, of the speed of detection. There are a bunch of detection systems, acoustic, radar, thermal, electronic. But if you're dealing about a facility that might be, not even have to be a dense urban environment, there's an awful lot that's going on in that EM spectrum. So trying to pick up and identify a drone to all the other noise that's out there is quite a challenge in itself. The issues around some of the countermeasures, as I said, taking a drone out and having it drop from the sky brings other issues in itself.
Yeah, we're seeing that in Dubai. Drone debris is some of the problem.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's some big old drones there, but even small drones, it's got to fall on one person, and you can see the duty of care issues. Jammers is a way forward, but actually the UK has some quite strict legislation, other countries less so, around jamming of the EM spectrum. So your choices of countermeasures can be, there's a lot of them, but you've got to then think about cost benefit of those. And this is why I mentioned the thought around actually being better at reacting rather than trying to prevent the event. And of course, drones don't have to be just attack drones. They can be used just for conducting reconnaissance, flying by a window where there's a presentation going on the first or second floor where you wouldn't be thinking about people looking in. You could fly a drone and park it there. They can be pretty quiet. You could film a whole presentation.
I'm used to talk about political violence on this podcast, and obviously you've got terrorism and straight out war risk and sabotage, but SRCC gets a lot of conversation these days. And how do these broader tensions that the insurance industry would call SRCC feed into the overall risk picture for data centres and their related assets?
I think with data centres, the consumption of the energy to power and cool data centres and the equipment, and actually looking at the SRCC, it's the environmental impact of that. So they require large physical site and resources. They can actually, the larger sites, we've seen them in urban areas, but the larger sites might be quite remote areas. And there could be consequences from the local community, and environmental activists will see these sites as drawing with resources away from the community or a town nearby. And then, this could lead to labour strikes and projects where the beneficiaries aren't where the site is. The benefit is being seen elsewhere, but they're still having their resources drained.
So you get a drone-wielding mob as opposed to a pitchfork-wielding mob.
Exactly, just from the local community harnessing these drones, but because their resources are being used for another means. We're looking closely with clients around that and actually be cognizant of their kind of interactions and where they're placing these centres, to be mindful of those potential issues from the outset of a project can help sort of prevent that local aggravation, as it were.
Thea, staying with you. So when you look at data centre risk through a broker's lens, how complex does the insurance response become in terms of multiple lines of business? We've talked about physical damage, so property, BI, business interruption, cyber, political violence. There's quite a few lines of business involved here.
Absolutely. And the interaction of insurance policies in this space needs to be maximised. When we're trying to anticipate complex risks our clients might be exposed to, we need to ensure where a policy stops or excludes, another should then react and fill the gap. And with these centres, valuations and limits will also need to be reviewed for the specific sort of high-value components and how easily and how costly it is to replace that specialist equipment. And then as well as we've already alluded to, the potential contingent business interruption along the supply chain afterwards. So looking at these different lines, we try to consider the possible scenarios that a data center or client might be facing. For example, a malicious cyber attack on a data center might cause physical damage, disable operations for days or weeks. In Latin America, for example, there are organized crime groups who are designated terrorist organizations by the US government. So is cyber terrorism being considered? And if it's on a cyber policy, does this extend to the physical damage? But then on the other side, should a cyber attack take down a security measure and allow a malicious actor inside the facility or cause damage, taking down a jammer to allow the drone to impact the site? What cyber exclusions are there under the terrorism policy to reimburse that physical damage loss? And we're trying to have constant conversations with insurers in the PVT space and cyberspace to try and align these concerns and avoid any gaps. And then, finally, we're looking at the consideration of a political risk angle. If you've got a cross-border data center project, could it be at risk from the home state, particularly if the benefit of the data center isn't serving the jurisdiction in which it's based? Could we see a state actually expropriate or seize an overseas data center for political gain?
I'm guessing that because these risks are emerging and out there are huge gaps there. It's probably more of an issue than duplication. Duplication is probably a good problem to have rather than gaps. And I'm guessing there's a lot more gaps than duplications going on.
I think it's around making sure that I think the gaps are very fillable and they're probably somewhere easily found, but it's making sure that our clients aren't relying on one without looking at the other. You can't assume it's covered somewhere else. I think it's looking at the whole picture rather than the silos of each class of business. I think it's how they interact. So I don't think we need to change the wheel to fill any gaps a client might have or might be concerned by, but it's just making sure that we are crossing those classes of business so that we try and fill them as best we can. Maybe there's areas that we haven't considered yet, but in the lines that we've got, how can we maximise that?
Jerry, different challenge to talk about now, attribution. Cyber's a great example of that. But yeah, especially if you've got organised crime groups, but potentially state-backed actors or something in between. How does that uncertainty affect gaps or overlaps in coverage? Things like war risk exclusions, and inevitably claims outcomes.
Well, the answer is that they can be quite significant. We've seen not only organised crime groups, but just, in fact, petty criminals are being hired over the internet by foreign service agents, and we've seen this with Russia and Iran, and being hired to use fire as a weapon, or in one case in Germany last year, delivering parcels that actually had a potential explosive device, and if those had got onto one of the DHL aircraft it was targeting, we could have seen a significant loss of life and disaster. So that sort of demand for attribution that the general public would have could be quite significant. War exclusions were not designed for modern hybrid threats. And as we said before, the general public view of the UK of Russia and Russia to us is two entirely different views, two different wars. And so how the Russians may perceive their intent of being an entirely natural extension of the conflict that we're currently in with them. So policies need to have more clarity, and the clarity may be more around accepting that attribution is something that can't be achieved. Because what we don't want to do is have clients perceive that they're insured and in fact the cover is not there. So that sort of brokers and advisors need to have that clearer knowledge and position and be comfortable with the unknown. And that uncertainty of attribution, it does risk claims being denied and then potentially all sorts of disruption to the wider market and the complexity of the market.
So Thea, let's turn to you then for the next question. And so people risk is, I think, an interesting angle to this. And it gets far away from the physical damage, the property focus of PV and terrorism market. But malicious risk obviously includes things like kidnap and ransom. So yeah, let's talk about that angle, particularly somewhere like Mexico.
Yeah, I think the high value and transportable nature of components housed in data centres make them not only targets at the physical site, but I guess also in transit. And they could negatively impact and expose the personnel responsible for the transportation of these components. I mean, in the US even, we've seen a case whereby a senior manager of an organisation was carrying a component destined for a data centre and was kidnapped as a result. And it's placing the value not just on the valuable component he was carrying, but also the individual themselves. And, Blackthorn, we feel there is a very real growing exposure here, not just for the transporting of property, but your everyday workers commuting to and from. The issue is that organised crime network or kidnap gangs, perhaps in this example coming up from the Mexican border, they'll perceive anyone who works there as a high-value target, either for the component and then, as we mentioned, the interruption that the loss of that component will cause. And they perceive anyone who works there as that high-value target. And the perception of the wealth is the key driver to kidnapping incident or security risk. You don't have to be the senior manager or the wealthy individual, but you are working for the wealthy employer or investor who you are going to disrupt by taking that individual or the component. So it's an interesting alternative security risk that data centres might be facing in their operations.
And that's not a political motive at all, is it? But it's certainly, still there as a potential one.
I think the higher the disruption you could cause, the higher your ransom is going to be, because you perceive that the resolution of that is high reward for the data centre. They're going to be more likely to pay quicker because the disruption is so great.
So looking ahead, what practical steps would you say risk managers and insurance buyers, what should they be taking now to better align coverage, improve their resilience and deal with these modern perils affecting modern assets?
I think from the outset, it's prioritising the understanding of those sort of first, second and third order impacts, looking beyond the immediate threats and plans how the wider geopolitics, infrastructure pressures or hybrid activities could actually impact on operational disruption and potential loss. The second thing is around strengthening decision-making uncertainty. So it's about having that robust crisis plan and capability set up there so that should the worst happen, then actually stopping it from progressing and responding and looking at speeding that recovery as quickly as possible. Identifying critical vulnerabilities and single points of failure. This is one thing that drones can do, is they can bring in those targeted attacks. So stress testing the infrastructure and supply chains and dependencies and just seeking to understand where those weak points are. We talked about hybrid malicious scenarios, and I think that's something that around the use of drones, but it could be in combination with other things, including riots, civil commotion as well. Classifying those escalation paths and roles, again, in that crisis management piece of just having that structured for rapid mobilization because of the speed that the perils can be deployed. And focusing on that resilience in depth. It's not just about a perimeter now. You've got to look at the whole area of your asset and where the vulnerable points are. And then ultimately, it's around supporting the alignment between operational resilience and your insurance buying strategy, understanding how operational countermeasures, your response capabilities and management of the uncertainty can demonstrate to the shareholders that actually security is actually adding value to the company as in terms of its resilience, as opposed to security being a cost.
From Blackthorn's perspective, we've seen security and malicious risk policies going straight to the top of, a risk manager's concern. For them, it will be critical to protect their people, but also their assets, their operations, and resulting reputations as well. This involves doing a deep dive into finding out whether they've got any gaps or exclusions and how their policies interact in the political violence, terrorism space and the kidnap for ransom space and the cyber and political risk policies, making sure that the gaps or any uncertainties are ironed out. We try to look into the crystal ball, so to speak, and anticipate to the best of our abilities what these exposures could look like and where the claim could fall across their insurance portfolio. But, as we said, this is all insurable and the market remains buoyant to handle the topics we've discussed today.
Jerry, thanks a lot. Thea, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
And that concludes this episode. Many thanks for listening. Please hit subscribe, like, leave a review, all that social goodness, and naturally please tune in again. Once again, thank you to my two wonderful guests, Thea Grootenhuis and Jerry Smith. I've been your host, David Benyon. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.